Hello, everyone. This is Shawn A. Barksdale. We're at the Red Hill Patrick Memorial Quarter Place commemoration and celebration for the slaves who lived here, worked here, and who helped build Red Hill, and they also died here. We're here with Mr. Mark Couvillion. How you doing, sir?
Doing well, thank you.
Beautiful. Our on-call historian.
Yes, sir.
Worked at Red Hill in the 80s. You've been working at Colonial Williamsburg roughly around the last 30 years?
Yes, sir.
Nice. While still connected to Red Hill?
Yes.
Oh, nice, man. All right, you serve as a trustee for Patrick Henry Memorial for 10 years?
Yes.
Now you're a curator.
Yes, I help with anything they need, be it, excuse me, be it research, training, the docents. Anytime a visitor has a question or a staff member, they send it my way to answer, send it back.
Okay.
So,
you also
on-call historian.
You also do articles for the newsletter?
Yes, the Red Hill newsletter.
Wow.
In fact,
that's a lot of work, brother.
Yes, the one coming up, I think in the next issue, actually has to deal with Patrick Henry and his role in chipping away at slavery.
Okay. That's going to be nice. That's going to be nice. So what type of trainings do you do?
Usually in the winter when it's slow, the staff will get together and we'll just go over things that most of these docents might be new. They might be here for a while and need a refresher course. So just talk about Patrick Henry's time here at Red Hill, what he did, how many acres he owned, what the buildings looked like, and of course the enslaved that were here, the children, family life. So just kind of overall cover for the docents to have a fresher course.
Understood. I hear that you're quite the writer.
Yes, sir. Yes.
How many books have you written?
5.
5 books?
Yes.
All of those books are dealing with the history and of Patrick Henry and Red Hill?
Yes. Usually I look for things that biographers have kind of either glossed over or, didn't really go into detail. And so I try to find things just to dig deeper. Like my latest book is on Patrick Henry's marriage to his first wife, Sarah Shelton. She developed mental illness. There's a lot of stories around that, especially on the internet, a lot of false stories. So I want to try to be as accurate as possible, figuring out when it started, her illness, what she had, how she was treated. So again, trying to just separate fact from fiction.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And one of the other books, my first book I did was on the many different homes that Patrick Henry lived in. He lived in 13 different homes throughout Virginia. And so it's kind of a guidebook, but it's also his biography woven into all these different places. And you can actually, there's even directions if you want a Sunday trip to go and visit some of these locations.
When I spoke earlier today, being that it's 10 minutes of truth, I told the truth. I didn't know a lot about Patrick Henry. I didn't know a lot about Red Hill. I definitely didn't know anything about the slaves. Because of that, once I started doing my investigation, we started collecting information. His first marriage is the connection to him in slavery.
True.
That I believe.
Yeah, I mean, yes, he grew up in a slave society, of course. His father owned slaves, his aunts and uncles, his half-brothers. So from the very beginning, he was surrounded with the slavery. And but it wasn't until he was 18, upon his marriage to Sarah Shelton in 1754, that part of his her dowry, or we want to say wedding present given to him by his father-in-law was 6 slaves and 300 acres of land. His own father, John Henry, also gave him 4 or 5 slaves. So he begins his married life, 18, as a slave owner for the first time, with at least 10 enslaved people. But it wouldn't be until a decade later, in 1764, when he purchases his own slave, a man named Isaac, that he becomes a slave owner of his own purchase.
Right.
So before they were given to him, but now he's starting to buy and sell enslaved people.
Mr. Couvillion, you have such a rich history, 30, 40-year history. It's impossible within 15, 20 minutes. We're going to have to revisit because you have a plethora, an abundance of information about this. I want to talk about something remarkable that you found in 1980. You stumbled up on something. What was that?
I think I know what you're talking about. It was, we were on a lunch break. The curator at that time period and me and the receptionist, we were just roaming around trying to find foundations for some of the old cabins. And we come up on this ridge, and before you know it, we're standing in a field with these stones. And we quickly realized, seeing, what we headstone and footstone that were in the middle of a graveyard.
Wow.
And to my knowledge, that's the first time, at least in recent history, that the enslaved graveyard was rediscovered as it was. I'm sure the people around here connected to it knew about it, but the foundation, as far as I know, really kind of just lost in the memory of the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation until 1985, when we came across the graveyard. We did a brief count, and at that time period, we only eyed, I think it was like 65 or 67 stones. Of course, they're still covered with grass and so forth. And of course, since then, it's more than doubled that number with the archaeological work that has been done. So it was a really, what do you want to call it, sensitive moment. I mean, just being in the presence, knowing that it was a graveyard of these people who worked for Patrick Henry. They had their own families and so forth. And here we see, it hits, it becomes a reality when you're standing in this middle of this graveyard.
Thank you for being nosy. Thank you. Because this is how I become a part of this, how I can help move that narrative, as I said, about my ancestors and telling that history and helping to get this information out. How did the Quarter Place earn the name?
Well, Quarter Place, we find, in fact, in Patrick Henry's will, another piece of property he owned 18 miles up the river, Long Island, which he lived in for 2 years before purchasing Red Hill. He refers to where the enslaved were living as the Quarter Place, the home, quarter, the quarters. And so we just kind of adapted that name that he used at his one property for this property. And then in the early 19th centuries, we start seeing that area referred to as the Quarter Place. So no doubt it was called that during Patrick Henry's time as well. And we're hoping to find more cabins. At present, we know the location of about 3 or 4, but we know from documentation, a census that was done, that they had at least 12 cabins. And during Patrick Henry's time, he had about 20 more slaves than this 1850 census, when there were about 50 enslaved people on the property. So they probably had at least 12 to 14 slave quarters somewhere on the property that yet to be discovered. So that's where archaeology is really going to play an important role, not only telling us where they lived, the size of the building, but also what they were eating, what they were eating off of and discarding. We can find a lot of that with the help of archaeology.
I'm excited to learn as I'm learning, as you guys are learning. I'm very excited about the future of learning about the court of place. Patrick Henry was a lawyer for a long time.
Yes, sir.
He was on the road months at a time, of course. During this time, would the slaves oversee themselves, like slaves oversee the slaves, or how would that be?
Typically, Patrick Henry had at least one overseer. This would have been a paid white person that would oversee and direct the slaves. I haven't yet found him having a overseer here at Red Hill.
Okay.
So since he was, quote, retired during the last few years of his life, he might have been overseeing the plantation doing morning rounds like George Washington would do at Mount Vernon.
Okay.
And he probably had a foreman, a trusted enslaved person to help him out. At Long Island, which he owned at the same time as Red Hill, he did have a full-time overseer there, a man named John Bradley, and then he was replaced by a man named Robert Pruitt. And so you have to kind of trust that he's going to be overseeing them correctly and properly. But yes, we are able to look at his account books and see pretty much throughout his life while he's on the road as an attorney, having an overseer on his property.
Okay.
And may I add, if you look at how many enslaved people Patrick Henry had at the time of his death, yes, it's a large number, 98. But if you look at Washington, that had over 300, Jefferson having over 200. In comparison, his is rather low the number. And I think one reason for that, as such a successful attorney, he wasn't having to rely solely on agriculture for his money. And so I think that's one reason why you don't see 200 or 300 enslaved names on the inventory here at Red Hill, because throughout his adult life, the majority of his income was from his law practice and not tobacco or wheat or what have you.
Okay. This moves us into another segment of his life. You saying that on these travels somewhere, he ran into another type of trade, which would be whiskey.
Yeah, this is something that we've just recently started to dig deeper in here at Red Hill. And it's ironically one of the most documented things we have, primary sources. In his inventory, it lists 3 stills, whiskey stills, ranging from 30 gallons up to 130 gallons. We have a letter that was written by Patrick Henry in 1796, trying to find a distiller to hire to look after the process, and also saying that he thinks he has enough rye and corn from Red Hill and his Long Island property to keep his stills going. We have his license that he had to get from the county court to make it legal and not moonshine.
Got it.
And it seems like he was running the still 5 months out of the year here at Red Hill. And he was probably making about 15, roughly conservative estimate, about 15 gallons a day. So probably around 2,000 gallons a year he was producing. So this was probably, next to his tobacco crops, his second most, where his income was coming from.
Okay. So that's about 5 months out of the year that he would be running the distillery?
Yes, from November to April.
Okay.
And this also ties in great with the enslaved story here.
That's what I was about to ask. What were their jobs inside of?
Yeah, of course, they're going to be working in the fields, help, cultivating the wheat, the corn, the rye, the barley that was used at this time period for whiskey. They're going to be gathering the wood to keep the stills going, the fire, gathering the water, probably mixing the ingredients with the help of the distiller to get the right amounts. They would be a cooper, on the property, a barrel maker, maybe the enslaved man named Jesse. We think he was a skilled craftsman because of the amount he was valued at, 200 pounds. That was the highest of any of the enslaved people of what their worth was valued out. So he might have been a blacksmith or a cooper making the barrels to put the whiskey in. Okay. And then you had to have enslaved help to get the whiskey carted to a tavern or a store at Charlotte Courthouse and so forth. So they would be involved in every single step of the process.
Tell our audience about a particular slave named Shadrach. He held a distinct piece here at Red Hill.
Even though we have the names of the 67 enslaved people who lived here, unfortunately, it didn't list what they did. Right. And so we've been trying to find through letters or Henry's account book if it mentions anything. And a few months after Patrick Henry's death, in 1800, his widow, Dorothea, is writing a family member saying that she's sending Shadrach, the coachman, to pick up their son at Hampton, Sydney, which is, about an hour away by car. Right. And so that's one of the few times we can tell what the job and the enslaved. And it's interesting because you have to trust Shadrach enough to send him alone to pick up the son and not just keep going. And so we know that he must have been a trusted member of the slave community here at Red Hill.
Right, absolutely. From what I understand, what I know, in those instances, it's because of the relationship that is built of trust, because we know that the master and the slave, they had their relationship, the relationship that they had. He knew that it was his master. He knew that was his slave, but you see these people every day.
Yeah.
And very similar to today's incarceration, in prison is very similar to slavery when you look at it. And as you go along, you gain a bond, right? Yes. You gain a bond with your warden, or you gain a bond with the overseer, so depending on who you are and your character. So that is going to help us moving along to be able to distinguish these relationships and get this information out into the communities, right? I
have an interesting story. Yeah. In the early 1900s, about 1905, a Patrick Henry biographer came to Red Hill, and he talked to some of the Black inhabitants around the area, and they gave him a number of anecdotes that were passed down through their family. Right. And one has to deal with, I don't know if you came across this name, Uncle Solomon.
Uncle Solomon.
Yeah, he's listed on the inventory. He was probably only about 15 or 16 years old. Okay. But he was supposedly a very strong individual. And the story passed down is that when Patrick Henry wanted to cross the Stanton River to get to his property on the other side, Halifax, he would get on Uncle Solomon's shoulders. Really? And they would ford the river. And they said that the old timers never laughed so hard when they when Solomon tried to prevent his master from getting wet. Right. And so this just gives you this glimpse into this this one anecdote of one of his enslaved people, Henry on his shoulders, going across the Stanton River. And it made an impact as it was passed down probably at least 2 or 3 generations for them to tell the biographer. I just thought I'd just throw that.
Absolutely.
And he's no doubt buried, Solomon in the grave. And I thought about these stories of Uncle Solomon and Jack White, who was half Indian. when I was walking around that graveyard, these names that come out of that early 1900 book,
Right.
yeah, it kind of really made an impact.
Mr. Couvillion, well, of course, I don't have the time as I spoke of earlier, but I'm going to have to bring you back because something interesting happens with the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yes, sorry.
And I know we're not going to be able to talk about it today, but can I get a commitment for you to come back on the show?
Certainly.
Because the tie-in between what happens with Alexander Hamilton and the new law, right? We have to dig into that.
Yeah.
We have to tell that story because there's a lot dealing with the enslaved. There's a lot dealing with taxation and the new government.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
And can I just add one more thing?
Absolutely. What is it?
I just want to, when people come to Red Hill, it's such a beautiful and peaceful
Absolutely.
place. And it's easy to forget that there were over 75 people living here, not just Patrick Henry's family that had 10 or 11 people living on the property, but again, at least 67 enslaved. And you would hear the hammering of the blacksmith, the smells coming from the kitchen, the animals mooing and so forth. And we often forget that it was a thriving community of both black and white living here in two different worlds, but on the same property.
And through those books that you have, we definitely look to tell those stories.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate you.